I will continue reading out Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Yesterday, I read the part where he wanted to be a painter, but his father vociferously detested that. After the magnificent, triumphant march of the victorious armies in the Franco-German War, the Germans in the Reich became steadily more and more estranged from the Germans beyond their frontiers, partly because they did not deign to appreciate those other Germans at their true value, or simply because they were incapable of doing so. The Germans of the Reich did not realize that if the Germans in Austria had not been of the best racial stock, they could never have given the stamped of their own character to an empire of 52 millions. So definitely that in Germany itself the idea arose, though quite an erroneous one, that Austria was a German state. That was an error which led to dire consequences, but all the same it was a magnificent testimony to the character of the 10 million Germans in that Ismark. Only very few of the Germans in Reich itself had an idea of the bitter struggle which those Eastern Germans had to carry on daily for the preservation of their German language, their German schools, and their German character. Only today, when a tragic fate has torn several millions of our kinsfolk away from the Reich and has forced them to live under the rule of the stranger, dreaming of that common fatherland towards which all their yearnings are directed, and struggling to uphold at least the sacred right of using their mother tongue. Only now have the wider circles of the German population come to realize what it means to have to fight for the traditions of one's race. And so at last, perhaps there are people here and there who can assess the greatness of that German spirit which animated the old Ismark and enabled those people, left entirely dependent on their own resources, to defend the empire against the Orient for several centuries, and subsequently to hold fast the frontiers of the German language through a guerrilla warfare of attrition. At a time when the German Empire was sedulously cultivating an interest for colonies, but not for its German Empire. But not for its own flesh and blood before the threshold of its own door. What has happened always and everywhere in every kind of struggle happened also in the language fight which was carried on in the old Austria. There were three groups: the fighters, the hedgers, and the traitors. Even in the schools, this sifting already began to take place, and it is worth noting that the struggle for the language was waged perhaps in its bitterest form around the school. Because this was a nursery where the seeds had to be watered which were to spring up and form the future generation. The tactical objective of the fight was the winning over of the child, and it was to the child that the first rallying cry was addressed. Open inverted comma. German youth, do not forget that you are a German, and remember, little girl, that one day you must be a German mother. Those who know something of the juvenile spirit can understand how youth will always lend a glad ear to such a rallying cry. Under many forms, the young people led the struggle, fighting in their own way and with their own weapons. They refused to sing non-German songs. The greater the efforts made to win them away from their German allegiance, the more they exalted the glory of their German heroes. They stinted themselves in buying things to eat so that they might spare their pennies to help the war chest of their elders. They were incredibly alert in the significance of what the non-German teachers said, and they contradicted in unison. They wore the forbidden emblems of their own kinsfolk and were happy when penalized for doing so, or even physically punished. In miniature, they were mirrors of loyalty from which the older people might learn a lesson. And thus, it was that at a comparatively early age, I took part in the struggle which the nationalities were waging against one another in the old Austria. When meetings were held for the South-marked German League and the School League, we wore cornflowers and black, red, gold colors to express our loyalty. We greeted one another with hail, and instead of the Austrian anthem, we sang our own Deutschland über alles, despite warnings and penalties. Thus the youth were educated politically at a time when the citizens of a so-called national state, for the most part, knew little of their own nationality except the language. Of course, I did not belong to the hedges. Within a little while, I had become an ardent German national, which has a different meaning from the party's significance attached to that phrase today. I developed very rapidly in the nationalist direction, and by the time I was 15 years old, I had come to understand the distinction between dynastic patriotism and nationalism based on the concept of folk, or people, my inclination being entirely in favor of the latter. Such a preference may not perhaps be clearly intelligible to those who have never taken the trouble to study the internal conditions that prevail under the Habsburg monarchy. Among historical studies, universal history was a subject almost exclusively taught in the Austrian schools. For of specific Austrian history, there was only very little. The fate of this state was closely bound up with the existence and development of Germany as a whole. So a division of history into German history and Austrian history would be practically inconceivable. And indeed, it was only when the German people came to be divided between two states that this division of German history began to take place. The insignia of a former imperial sovereignty, which were still preserved in Vienna, appeared to act as a magical relics rather than as the visible guarantee of an everlasting bond of union. When the Habsburg state crumbled to pieces in 1918, the Austrian Germans instinctively raised an outcry for union with their German fatherland. That was the voice of a unanimous yearning in the hearts of the whole people for a return to the unforgotten home of their fathers. But such a general yearning could not be explained except by attributing the cause of it to the historical training through which the individual Austrian Germans had passed. Therein lay a spring that never dried up. Especially in times of distraction and forgetfulness, its quiet voice was a reminder of the past, bidding the people to look out beyond the mere welfare of the moment to a new future. The teaching of universal history in what we are called the middle schools is still very unsatisfactory. Few teachers realize that the purpose of teaching history is not the memorizing of some dates and facts, that the student is not interested in knowing the exact date of a battle or the birthday of some marshal or other, and not at all, or at least only very insignificantly interested in knowing when the crown of his fathers was placed on the brow of some monarch. These are certainly not looked upon as important matters. To study history means to search for and discover the forces that are the causes of those results which appear before our eyes as historical events. The art of reading and studying consists in remembering the essentials and forgetting what is not essential. Probably my whole future life was determined by the fact that I had a professor of history who understood, as few others understand, how to make this viewpoint prevail in teaching and in examining. This teacher was Dr. Leopold Poyetsch of the Real School at Linz. He was the ideal personification of the qualities necessary to a teacher of history in the sense I've mentioned above. An elderly gentleman with a decisive manner but a kindly heart, he was a very attractive speaker and was able to inspire us with his own enthusiasm. Even today, I cannot recall without emotion that venerable personality whose enthusiastic exposition of history so often made us entirely forget the present and allow ourselves to be transported as if by magic into the past. He penetrated through the dim mist of thousands of years and transformed the historical memory of the dead past into a living reality. When we listened to him, we became afire with enthusiasm, and we were sometimes moved even to tears. It was still more fortunate that this professor was able not only to illustrate the past by examples from the It was still more fortunate that this professor was able not only to illustrate the past by examples from the present, but from the past he was also able to draw a lesson for the present. He understood better than any other the everyday problems that were then agitating our minds. The national fervor which we felt in our own small way was utilized by him as an instrument of our education, inasmuch as he often appealed to our national sense of honor. For in that way he maintained order and held our attention much more easily than he could have done by any other means. It was because I had such a professor that history became my favorite subject, as a natural consequence, but without the conscious connivance of my professor. I then and there became a young rebel. But who could have studied German history under such a teacher and not become an enemy of that state, whose rulers exercised such a disastrous influence on the destinies of the German nation? Finally, how could one remain a faithful subject of the House of Habsburg, whose past history and present conduct prove it to be ready ever and always to betray the interests of the German people, for the sake of paltry personal interest? Did not we as youngsters fully realize that the House of Habsburg did not and could not have any love for us Germans? What history taught us about the policy followed by the House of Habsburg was corroborated by our own everyday experiences. In the North and in the South, the poison of foreign races was eating into the body of our people. And even Vienna was steadily becoming more and more non-German city. The imperial house favored the Czechs on every possible occasion. Indeed, it was the hand of the goddess of eternal justice and inexorable retribution that caused the most deadly enemy of Germanism in Austria, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, to fall by the very bullets which he himself had helped to cast. Working from above downwards, he was the chief patron of the movement to make Austria a slave state. The burdens laid on the shoulders of the German people were enormous, and the sacrifices of money and blood which they had to make were incredibly heavy. Yet anybody who was not quite blind must have seen that it was all in vain. What affected us most bitterly was the consciousness of the fact that this whole system was morally shielded by the alliance with Germany. Whereby the slow extirpation of Germanism in the old Austrian monarchy seemed in some way to be more or less sanctioned by Germany itself. Habsburg hypocrisy, which endeavored outwardly to make the people believe that Austria still remained a German state, increased the feeling of hatred against the imperial house and at the same time aroused a spirit of rebellion and contempt. But in the German Empire itself, those who were then its rulers saw nothing of what all this meant. As it struck blind, I'll stop here and continue tomorrow. See you.